Linux Inlaws, a podcast on free Libre open source software. Broadcasting from the United Kingdom and Germany.
Welcome to Linux Inlaws, Season 2, Episode 35. Martin, how are things? On this beautiful summer evening in the year 2074 in June.
Oh, you got the flux capacitor working then.
Yes, indeed. I did, Martin, I did.
Excellent. Going back in time, 50 years or so.
Keep going, Professor.
Clearly, I just celebrated my 100th birthday. I'm doing fine thanks to all the weight loss and age suppression drugs. And
excellent.
I can still remember a thing or two from 50 years ago.
And with that,
you want to ask me any questions?
And with that, we would like to introduce our guest, Mirko. Why don't you take it away?
Yeah, so I was born about 100 years ago in 1947. I'm Mirko Böhm. I do community development for Linux Foundation Europe. I'm based close to Berlin in Germany. I enjoy working in the open source community. It has been with me for a long time. I started as a contributor to the KDE project in 98 or 7. We can't just figure it out anymore. Something like that.
You weren't joking about being born in 47. I see. Okay, fair enough.
No, 74. Sorry. I misspeak.
I see. Okay.
So learning C++ was about the first thing I did right after middle school. Joking. But over time, I've worked in various different roles in the open source community, including dealing with protecting Linux from patent threats. And other things. And now I'm at the Linux Foundation, really enjoying it, getting up every morning, thinking, what can I do for the open source community today? So that's
Mirko,
me.
There might be two listeners in the audience who do not know necessarily what the Linux Foundation is and what it stands for and why it is important.
Okay, so if that's new to you, Linux Foundation is a global hosting organization for open source project. It started with the Linux kernel, facilitating Linux kernel community in the development process. That's where the name comes from. And over time, we have adopted multiple projects, started other projects. And today we're hosting roughly 1,000 projects, all open source, all openly governed, about a third unfunded technical projects, and the rest projects that are collaboratively funded by all the participants. Projects include things like Linux kernel, OpenJS, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, Open Wallet, and many others. Your friendly open source foundation that deals with making the trains run on time for the projects and making sure the contributors can do their work.
So people, you know it all now. That has been the shortest episode ever of something called Linux Inlaws. Thank you for listening and keep up the good work.
Yeah, have a good day.
Jokes aside, why don't you go into a little bit of the history about the Linux Foundation? It was founded more than 20 years ago, if I'm completely mistaken. I wasn't around at the time, although I was using Linux. But probably now is the time to shed some more light where it all came from and why it is so bloody important.
That's a very good question. And I told you I'm now 100 years old, so I can't remember all the details. It's been a long time ago when the Linux Foundation was formed basically as a merger of the open source development labs and the free standards group. That was in 2007. And at the time, I think all of us in the open source community were still figuring out how can we make projects run in a way that they run kind of according to the ideals of open source development, open to everybody for participation, openly governed, transparent. And since then, that is what we have been developing and growing in terms of project portfolio and participation membership. And I think probably because our model is trusted in a way by many participants, both individuals and commercial companies, more and more projects started to come to us, and these projects really also started to grow. So I did some research work when I was long before I joined the Linux Foundation on projects that had gathered the character of actually like drivers of software innovation worldwide. And half of the case studies were at the time Linux Foundation projects, including at the time Kubernetes or automotive grade Linux. And this is what we are today. I think we're a good chunk of the open source ecosystem, to put it that way. We're not all of it, and we're good friends with our fellow communities, but many important projects are hosted with us today. I think that's mostly why people think we're important, and we think we are helping the open source ecosystem.
I think that's the biggest understatement of the century. To call a Linux Foundation just an amalgamation of open source project is just wow.
But that's what we are. I mean,
yes, but we had full disclosure. We had the Cloud Native Foundation on the podcast before.
Mm-hmm.
The Open Software Security Foundation, of course, was one of the latest additions. But when I was working, full disclosure again, I was working at Verizon about 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. And the OCI, as in the Open Container Initiative, were just basically being formed. And these are just three examples of your comprehensive ecosystem of very industry-shaping projects, so to speak. And just to call this a collection of open source projects is probably not hitting the mark as such.
Well, it's a bit of my take on this, and I think this is in line with the general approach of hopeful, helpful, humble that the Linux Foundation is trying to apply. We are, in fact, a support organization. So you mentioned these initiatives. I think the OpenSSF, Open Source Security Foundation, is crucially important worldwide right now as an organization that has taken good practices on cybersecurity developed by various open source communities and made them best practices, communicated them, made the world adapt them, and I think that has made the world a better place. You can say it this way, but we are, as the Linux Foundation, we are supporting this organization. We are giving it a home in a nonprofit environment with transparent governance, and that's why I think you can actually describe the Linux Foundation as a collection, a portfolio of important open source projects. It's not wrong. It might be a bit of understatement, but
I mean, we already spoke about the automotive grade Linux in the previous podcast as an episode and some other topics also. To describe the role of the Linux Foundation as an industry shaping is probably underestimating the whole effort. Probably now is the time to describe a little bit about your membership structure.
So before we go into that, you said Linux Foundation is like, it's an understatement to just say it's a collection of projects. We are a part of the open source ecosystem. That's maybe a good way to think about it. I think we're a big part, a large share of the overall number of projects, but we're still just a part. And there are many projects in the whole upstream downstream network that are crucially important to open source that are not hosted by the Linux Foundation. That's why it's important for all of us to keep in mind that our primary role is to make sure we can develop open source software, we can release it, and our users can consume it. And this is what we're trying to do. So maybe that's where my take came from. So now to your second question. What was it? I forgot.
The role of some of the projects and impact on the overall industry as such, and the automotive grade Linux probably would be just one example. Never mind the OSSF and the OCI, as in the Open Container Initiative, which was crucial in defining standards for what is now known as probably the most important workload driving other people's computers, known as clouds.
You see, I don't have to do all this bragging. You're doing it for me. I like that.
You're welcome.
But you asked about our member structure, and now, being 100 years old makes it difficult to remember all the details.
Just go ahead.
Yeah. So Linux Foundation is an organization that is driven by members. We're funded by members. We're a non-profit organization, and our members, our commercial members, pay a fee, a membership fee into our organization, into projects. And we use that. Non-profit here means we use all the funding that we get and spend it to facilitate the projects. This includes all sorts of functions, from event organization to legal support to finance and marketing. And an important thing to know, I think, is that we are very lucky to have more than 1,000 corporate members. And that means that each of all the individual members, not a single one provides us with more than 3% of our funding. That's a very important number from my perspective, because it means that it's like many people have influence in the Linux Foundation. If you participate, if you engage, if you become a member, you have influence, and it's actually possible to participate together with very large companies, even if you're a small one. So that's our structure, basically. We also have a lot of individual members, and we also have, beyond the members, a huge community of contributors. You don't have to be a member of a project to contribute from a technical perspective to the project. The members engage to keep the project viable in the long term and contribute to the funding of the project.
So, I mean, there's you mentioned there's many corporate sponsors of the project. How does that governance of that income work in the Linux Foundation? I mean, obviously you sponsor conferences and things like that. What else is or is there some kind of model, guidance, strategy of, clearly open source funding is always a topic. So how do you deal with, let's say, getting a lot of money in and then dealing with it?
Well, a good approach to understanding that is that all our projects are basically funding themselves. Meaning, if you become a member of, let's say, Automotive Grade Linux, we had that example earlier, then you're paying into the fund that pays for Automotive Grade Linux. And the project spends the funding that it has on activities that Automotive Grade Linux thinks are important for it. And who makes the decisions on that? It's the governing board, which is formed through like a representative and election process from everybody who participates in the funding of the project. Every project is in itself considered to be non-profit. So all the projects are supposed to spend the funding that they get for the benefit of the project. And a small percentage, 9% or less, go to the Linux Foundation central team, which pays, for example, for me. And we are then coordinating the whole project portfolio, all the activities, and manage events like the Open Source Summit and other events that are horizontal for the whole open source ecosystem. We invite everybody there. So this is basically how it works. The project raises the funds that it needs to administer and run the project. That's why projects have members, and based on that funding, the projects are operating. Another aspect to keep in mind here is that for the most part, we do not hire contributors. We provide project management activities, marketing. We hire maybe a maintainer if the funds are there for that. But almost all of the development work is done downstream in adopters of the software, who are then contributing with the integration point of the software. So the management or administration overhead of our project is comparatively low to the overall investment into the technology. That doesn't happen at the Linux Foundation. That happens in our participating companies and individuals.
Yeah, it makes sense. I didn't realize you were actually also hiring maintainers. Can you give some examples of...
Very few. I said it's an exception. So we have a few people on payroll, like Linus Torvalds or Greg KH or Richard Purdy for Yocto. But for the most part, that's not the case, right? For the most part, the funding we get is for facilitating the project and administrative support. And all the full-time equivalents that are paid for actual development are in the organizations that use the software downstream.
Makes sense. I mean, so you are host to many important open source projects, right? And that list is ever growing, I imagine. How does clearly you do a lot of publicity and events around, organized by Linux Foundation, where these projects can participate and market themselves in a way. So there are also other open source organizations out there. What would you say the Linux Foundation's kind of role is compared to some of the other ones out there?
Mm-hmm. So I said earlier, we are one part of the open source ecosystem. We're proud that we're hosting many important projects, as you have mentioned. But we're fully aware that if you want to build any fully functional Linux distribution, for example, you're including code from various organizations, from many communities that are not incorporated, individuals or loose networks of people that are just working together to develop software. And so we're aware of that, and that means that we maintain good relationships to our fellow hosts and facilitators of open source projects. There is a healthy competition, for example, if new projects come up, where should they be hosted? Healthy in the sense that also makes sure that the foundations, including us, are set up and operating in a way that is focused on serving the communities, because the communities are the ones that we need to convince to come to us. So how does our project portfolio grow? Well, usually it's that new projects emerge and they say, we know it's a great way to run an open source project, especially if you need open governance and transparency and the trust that the project's not controlled by a single entity. And we know that the Linux Foundation is a great host for that. And that's why projects come to us. And I think it's in the end always a choice that the communities make, which organization, which umbrella is the most fitting one to slip under. And we're happy that many communities think we are the umbrella where they want to be. So recently, Project Jupyter, I'm quite happy about that because I'm using it myself a lot.
Interesting observation there in terms of the umbrella organization. Given the fact that you are incorporated as a non-profit in terms of 401c6, the avid listeners, of course, will remember this breathtaking episode on non-profits in the US that we ran at some stage. No, jokes aside.
Is that the 4-hour one?
Martin. And of course, a 401c6, as these listeners will recall, is classified as a business league or a board of trade or even a professional football league organization like this. How do you liaise with other dissimilar non-profits like the Free Software Foundation, like the OSI, the Open Source Institute, or even the EFF, if that rings a bell?
It does. And first of all, I am not a lawyer nor a US citizen, so these numbers mean
understood.
Very they're not very little to me, but I'm not the expert to talk about the details.
Well, we have an episode on this, so you can always read up.
I can go back.
We do.
Study out.
If you want to catch up on this, yes.
So one thing is, there's an interesting philosophical angle here, and that is a C6 organization serves the interests of its members, whereas a charity serves the interests of society. And now this is an interesting philosophical perspective because we have to ask, what are the interests of the open source ecosystem engaged in a specific project?
Mirko, max yourself out. We have about 6 hours left on the podcast, on the episode.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm going to go in detail here. Hold on. So for me, open source communities were always, I always compare them to like sovereign states. Like they are their own authority. They exist because the citizens of the community decide that it should exist. And if those citizens would decide that it would dissolve, then it goes away. There's no outside authority, except of course tax law and other things, but there's no outside authority to tell the community what to do. So what better way to run an open source community than to say that all the involved contributors have a say, and they should say what the project is doing. And that is essentially a trade organization, if you organize it with a commercial background. A charity has to follow the interests of society, and therefore this is only a suitable setup for an open source community if that's what you want to do. And this is an interesting thought experiment, right? When we develop software and release it, are we primarily are we scratching our own itch, as we always said in open source, or are we doing this to make society a better place? The answer is probably we do both. But it's not that the charitable cause trumps being there existing for the benefit of your own community. You see what I mean? And so there's no natural choice for me between being like a social club or a trade organization or a charity. In the Linux Foundation, this means that we actually have a subsidiary that is hosting charitable projects whose mission it is explicitly to support, to make society a better place. But not all of our projects are organized this way. And to your question of what are our relation with other organizations that have different forms, we must understand that most open source organizations, they get along pretty well because they're all, they're not serving the world. They're serving a specific community of users and developers. And these communities might overlap, but they're rarely in conflict. So we're good friends with the Python Software Foundation, with the Rust Foundation. I have personally been engaged in the open source initiative for a long time, or in Free Software Foundation Europe. And sometimes we disagree on details, but overall I can say that there is a fruitful and healthy collaboration between the organizations. And sometimes, as I said, there's some healthy competition, like if two foundations spin up projects that have similar focus, then we're competing for the community. I would say mostly that's good for the community because it keeps the foundations on its toes to serve the communities, and it gives the communities a choice where they think their interests will be best supported.
Speaking of the FSFE, given the fact that you are located in Berlin, so is Martin Kirchner. So is Matthias Kirchner. Sorry, Matthias, if you're listening, Mirko is a neighbor. How do you engage? Just naming the FSFE as one example. How do you engage with the Free Software Foundation Europe if you are both located in Berlin, as much of the board of the FSFE as actually is?
Well, first of all, that has nothing to do with Linux Foundation. For me personally, I have been part of FSFE for years. I've eventually decided to move on, so I'm proud of the contributions I made. I think I was instrumental, not alone, but with others, in starting the Public Money, Public Code campaign.
Wow.
Yeah, I can claim that the meeting where this campaign was designed actually happened in the office of my company at the time, and we sponsored the meeting.
How to spill the beans?
Yeah.
Sorry. We should probably explain what this campaign was or is still all about, because people, if you're listening, and especially if you're based in Germany, never mind Europe, this is important. Please pay attention right now. Don't press skip forward. Mirko, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So if you have another 4 hours,
yes, we do.
Okay. So the logic behind the Public Money, Public Code campaign is that we say if our public spends our tax money to acquire or develop software, this is technically owned by the public based on taxes. So we say that should be released under an open source license for 2 reasons. One is to enable reuse and enable, for example, multiple municipalities to develop the same software together instead of 15 times. And it allows us to be more sovereign in how we deal with software by being able to understand it, to change it, and to operate it to the way we like it. So I think Public Money, Public Code is a very good way to think about how software developed in the public sector with tax money should be managed. It's a campaign because it's not the norm, right? It's almost nowhere the norm that when we spend public money, the results are released to the public, which I think is a mistake. There's one country that stands out as having recently implemented a law that changes that, and that's Switzerland, who have country, Switzerland, has said if public money is spent on software development, we will release the results on an open source license. So way to go, Switzerland. Thank you. Thank you for the good example. And I hope that my country, Germany, and others are following it. Yeah, and there's also I'm an economist, so there's the idea that open source software, the licenses of open source software make open source a public good. That means there's a very direct relationship between what the public does with our tax money and, in this case, usually private or voluntary initiatives creating other public goods, and they should be totally complementary. And that's why, if public money is spent, the results should be public code.
Interesting, because this is slightly off topic, but it's still worth touching upon, because you have this movement all over Europe, for example, Scandinavia, forcing, my words of course, their public sector to adopt more and more open source software. There was just today a hearing in Berlin about the federal government adopting open source left, right, and center, if I'm not completely mistaken.
Yeah, I couldn't go because I had to prioritize our podcast today. So
yes, of course, the links will be in the show notes, people. If this is something worth listening to in terms of close to your heart, as I said, I think the FSFE recorded this. The links will be in the show notes. Going back to my original statement, you have this movement all over Europe. For example, France has adopted a staged movement towards open source, for example, especially in the public sector, because they basically told the public sector that ultimately you will be using open source left, right, and center, as in this failed experiment, let's put it this way, that Munich tried all of those decades ago. Okay, we should probably fill in listeners who are not familiar with the Munich debacle. About 20 years ago, correct me if I'm wrong, Mirko, the local government, in terms of the city council in Munich, decided to go open source, but that was a botched effort because the opposition brought in political grounds and forced them back to a Microsoft way. Never mind Microsoft pouring an awful lot of money into a local campaign. We leave it at that. Details maybe in the show notes. To put a long story short, some governments, local or even federal in Europe, or centralized, for want of a better expression, in terms of the particular government structure depending upon, have adopted an open source stance moving forward. And you'll see this actually happening all over Europe. And I reckon the states used to follow suit, but I'm not too sure about the upcoming legislation as such. Any thoughts?
I think you're too optimistic here.
As usual.
I'm also somebody who loves to be optimistic, but when it comes to like a strategic adoption of open source software at the level of like states in Europe or the European Union or the US, we see attempts, valid attempts, but we don't see an overarching strategy yet. If you think about it, I actually gave a presentation about this recently. I can send you the link after.
Please do.
What the share is of public spending in average in the European Union on overall GDP?
Fill my gap.
It's about 49%. So roughly half of what we're spending in Europe is in the control of our countries. And what does this mean?
Less than that. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, what does this mean? If the public would say, in 5 years, I want to acquire an open source desktop that has all software that I need to run the government. With this money, this would 100% be possible. If our public would, ideally at the level of the European Union, not every individual state, if we would say, we want to roll out public services based on open source software, we would be 100% able to ask the industry to develop that with this kind of money. And this understanding that the power of the purse means you get to control what kind of software is delivered to you. I don't think our tax spenders and our public service procurers have fully grasped that yet. And
couldn't
also,
agree more.
yeah,
You're
also
absolutely
what?
spot on.
Sorry.
You're absolutely spot on. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, so I think that's a missed opportunity from my perspective. The missed opportunity is use the power of the purse more to say what you would like to acquire and not pick between the solutions that the proprietary software vendors offer you. And the other one is, oh, I forgot my train of thought. We have to get back to this. I forgot the second point.
You take all your time you want.
That happens when you're 100 years old, I'm telling you.
The memory enhancement didn't work.
Wait, let me take my
While you
Martin
think about
has
that,
some pills for this.
yeah, well, no, I don't. I forget a lot of things, but there we go. While you think about this one, okay, so desktop software developed for governments and so on, fine. What about, I mean, many government organizations, departments, what have you, they, lots of them have adopted cloud, right, for a long time. How do we consider that in the open source landscape?
Before I get to that, maybe I want to add one thing, and that is, of course, I said we don't have an overarching strategy yet, but we do have beacons of hope. We have the Open Code project and the Open Desk project in Europe, and the Center for Digital Sovereignty, who are embodying the idea of a transition to more open source and openly governed software for the public sector. They're already collaborating with France, with DINUM, so we're starting to see international collaboration here as well. And I think these are examples, and if there are policymakers are listening here, these are examples that we should analyze and replicate. And the most important aspect is that we need to understand that even in the public, collaboration to develop software is much more efficient than doing it all on your own. And I also want to mention the Sovereign Tech Agency, so far mostly known as the Sovereign Tech Fund, who has, with a small budget compared to the overall spending on IT, very effectively fostered key open source projects to be more viable, to be better maintained, to be more secure. And this shows that we have islands in our governments that understand the importance of open source software and are starting to invest in the right direction. And there are currently discussions at the European Union level to take this whole one level up, this whole thing, and apply it with bigger budget. And I'm very hopeful that this will yield good results.
Is this something that the Linux Foundation can influence, or let's say lobby with the government?
Well, we are sometimes explainers, if you will.
Yeah.
We'd say, how does this ecosystem work? It's. I must say, if you come from if you're a public sector career servant and you are exposed to the open source ecosystem for the first time, let's say in 2005, it must be a mystery to you. Like this idea that people are just collaborating in a decentralized way, everybody contributes what they think makes sense, and how somehow magically a usable something comes out of that this just wouldn't work in your worldview. And so a lot of the time, so I've been, let's make it less abstract and more concrete, I've had meetings with the European Patent Office, and we literally had a 2-hour presentation on how is open source software developed at all, and how does the licensing facilitate open collaboration and all of that.
And you survived this.
I'd actually did it multiple times. I gave a similar.
I know that Simon Phipps has been struggling with it. Has been struggling with this for ages. Of course, Simon Phipps being one of the OSI guys.
Yeah, so Simon Phipps is like a colleague on this. We occasionally work together. Also with the European Standards Development Organizations, I was for some time, I was the representative of the open source initiative at ETSI and their open source group. This is a role that thankfully Simon has taken over now and laments about it. But yeah, similarly, so standards developers, the European Judges Association, I think, if I remember correctly, invited me to give a presentation once also about how is this openly licensed software developed, valuable, and who owns it. So a lot of our role is we facilitate our projects and we explain to others what we do, because they see a successful model that is helping drive innovation, and they want to replicate it. And sometimes that works. Sometimes other environments have different parameters, and then you can't just replicate the model that the Linux Foundation applies, like in the public sector. But everybody, I think, is keen to learn.
Changing tack just a little bit. Given the fact that the Linux Foundation, never mind its incorporation as a 401c, it's mostly predominantly going also by the sponsorship structure, a somewhat North American / international organization. How do you see the support, for want of a better word, on a European level? Never mind the fact that probably most of our listeners are in the US, but work away anyway.
Well, that's a very good question, and it's funny that you should ask me that, because I work for Linux Foundation in Europe. Right?
Exactly. So why don't you explain what that is in the first place? Exactly.
Thank you for this high pass. So, of course, I mean, open source collaboration is global. Like, we never think of a project of being like let's say an Asian open source project. We may have projects that originate from a certain area, but we then make it available to anybody for any purpose. So it immediately becomes global when you say it's an open source project. What we need to facilitate is that this kind of collaboration can work everywhere. Every organization has a gravity center and a home where it emerged, where many of its contributors or maybe staff are located. And for the Linux Foundation, this is in the US. Linux Foundation was started in the US and it grew there. And Linux Foundation realized that presence in Europe to be able to support the European community is crucial. And therefore, we started Linux Foundation Europe. And our role in Europe is to facilitate projects that are hosted in. We can actually host projects in Europe. So some of our Linux Foundation projects have a legal residence in Europe, not in the US. Wherever this makes more sense. Sometimes projects get grants from the Horizon Europe program or other reasons. And then it's beneficial for them to be hosted in Europe, and then we can do that. And actually, that's my role, is helping to set up projects and to run the projects that are hosted in Europe. We also realize that the European Union is a, let's say, forceful regulator of the digital or tech market, if you will. And of course, the European Union says we're regulating our own internal market. But we've seen with GDPR that if the EU says you have to follow a certain baseline for consumer data protection, this kind of radiates into other regions as well, because of course there are vendors of services and products in other regions that sell in Europe. And then they realize they will have to follow these principles and basic requirements. And that has become a working model in the EU. So, for example, recently with the Cyber Resilience Act, one of the key insights that we had as the open source community, or as part of the open source community, was that this will affect everybody. Manufacturers in Japan, manufacturers in the US, everybody who wants to sell in Europe has to follow and implement this law and be compliant with it. And that means there is a necessity to represent the interests of our project portfolio also in Europe, mostly to the European Commission and the European Parliament, and to support in drafting legislation that is driving, say, a European value-driven internal market, more privacy protection, more empowered consumers and things like that, without damaging and ideally with encouraging the development of open source software. And I think we've offered our support here together with other communities and foundations, I must say. And it was quite interesting that the European Commission was very willing to listen to the input we have provided. And our role here is then not to say, oh, you should give us special treatment. Our role is more to say, this is how this ecosystem works. And you have a lot of people who voluntarily contribute code to something that they don't get paid for. And that makes sense, and it becomes a public good. So the public has an interest in supporting this development. So that's basically what we do. And I think it's quite appreciated also in Europe, both by the community and by policymakers that we're here.
Never mind that we're talking about, I think, the second biggest economy on the planet, if not completely mistaken.
Yeah, depends on how you count.
In terms
yeah.
of numbers, as in gross domestic product, so to speak. So a force to be reckoned with, let's put it this way.
Yeah, that's maybe one of the key aspects of this regulatory approach of making things like cybersecurity obligations a market access criteria. When you say I manage like 1/3 of the global market, every manufacturer who wants to make products worldwide will want to be in this market. So if I say you have to support products with security fixes for 5 years or longer, everybody will get security fixes for 5 years and longer, and that's a good thing.
Absolutely.
So the European Union fully understands its weight in the global economy.
Going back to the LFE versus the Linux Foundation, is it a subsidiary? Is it comparable to the FSF and the FSFE, which of course is a sister, the Free Software Foundation Europe is a sister foundation, is a sister organization of the FSF as the Free Software Foundation, because they are affiliated, yes, but the FSFE is not a subsidiary of the FSF. What about the Linux Foundation Europe versus the Linux Foundation as such?
Yeah, that's much simpler. So we are a subsidiary of the Linux Foundation. The organization has to exist somewhere.
Okay.
If you set it up independently, you have a governance problem, right? Somebody has to be responsible to run this organization, and somebody must exercise oversight. Now, who's supposed to be that? And I actually feel quite comfortable because the Linux Foundation as a whole is managed by, has oversight from a governing board that is quite active, and it represents a very broad cross-section of the community. And so they're also my oversight board, if you will, if I operate in Europe. And I think that represents the reality on the ground. And it's always good if power, responsibility, governance, and oversight are all matching, what's actually happening on the ground. And so, it's not like with FSF and FSFE, who are independent sister organizations. We, LF Europe, are a subsidiary of the Linux Foundation. We call ourselves the European chapter of the Linux Foundation.
Okay.
And why I like this setup is that there is no difference, no gap between the policy, the strategies that Linux Foundation is applying globally. Keep in mind, open source collaboration is global, and what we do in Europe. We adapt to local needs, but we're all still following or working towards the same vision, which is make this project portfolio successful and facilitate the communities.
Okay. Changing tack just a little bit again. If I take a look at your members, there's hardly a few hyperscalers missing. I reckon there's a reason for this.
I would suggest don't just look at the members, also look at the contribution numbers. Most projects have statistics public, breaking down contributions by where do the contributors work. And you will find that there's a very close match between who contributes the most or significantly and who's a member in the Linux Foundation. Because you have to ask a little bit, what does it give you to be a member of the Linux Foundation? First of all,
please.
Yeah, you have to pay a fee.
Of course.
And then you get to influence or facilitate, make viable this organization. As one key interest that our members have is make sure that the Linux Foundation continues to exist and continues its good work. But for the most part, our members join us because they want to be part of a project. So you mentioned the Open Container Initiative. Imagine you're an industry player, you're innovating with products, and this initiative is created. Yes, you want to be at the table. You want to say, I want to understand where this is going. I want to know the technologies that are being released 6 and 12 months from now. That's what you're getting from engaging. You want to say, I want to make sure that this standard stays competitive over 10, 15 years. So I'll dedicate a few resources from my company to contribute to the development of this specification. And I'll be a member in the organization to make sure the organization continues to exist. So most of our members come for the projects. And they want to make sure the projects are viable, continue to be developed, have the right roadmap, and that's why they join. And there's a very mature way to think about this. If you really thought about open source long time and with a strategic view. And that is every manufacturer that makes products has a couple of critical dependencies. A good example here is the Yocto project, which drives, I don't know what percentage of devices worldwide, but it's more than 2/3. If the Yocto project would go away tomorrow, many manufacturers would have a massive problem. So you have a massive interest to say, I want to make sure this project stays where it is, continues to develop, does not go away, and keeps doing what it does. And that's what our members get from us, right? They engage in that. They share this investment with others who have similar interests. And as a result, they get trustworthy dependencies. And that's what we're doing. I said in the beginning, we're facilitators for Project Portfolio and for our communities. And I think this is really at the heart.
Okay, just an even weirder question, if I may. If I take a look at the technical advisory board, I see many, many, many old school members of the revolution, so to speak. I see Greg, I see Ted, of course, for the people who do not have subscribed to the Linux kernel mailing list. Greg is one of the kernel maintainers, as in Greg Core-Hartman, and Tetsuo did X3, X2, X4, if I'm not completely mistaken. But I only see one Laura Abbott of Oxide Computers. Of course, for the people who are not familiar with the company, Oxide Computers is actually, how can I describe this? A hybrid cloud server provisioning company that has one important employee, a guy called Steve Klapnick. And for the hipsters in the audience, Steve Klapnick, of course, A, was on our podcast, and B, is one of the most influential members, my words, of something called the Rust community. Given the fact that Rust is making its stride in the kernel, what are your thoughts on going forward with this advisory board? Any wild opinions, of course, are appreciated.
Well, first of all, I feel kindly offended. I told you I'm now 100 years old, and that's no reason. That's no reason not to contribute to open source. I've been called roughly, I would say it must be about 10 years ago now, I've been called a dinosaur of open source because I've been doing it for a long time. Now, 10 years later, I'm still doing it.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah. So that means I actually celebrate, like I party hard when I see people that I know for a long time now that were there when I joined and started becoming an open source contributor, and they're still here. And actually, that's one of the things the Linux Foundation does, is we appoint a couple of fellows, people that we pay their salaries and say, go do the best for open source. And we enable this for a few fellows. So, yeah, I think it's a lot of recognition if you're in this group of advisors. Now, it's an advisory group. It's not the group that decides over the direction of development. So I think it's a good group, and I'm working closely together with many of them. So I feel good about it, if that was your question.
No, it wasn't. I'm going to ask a much more controversial question now. Don't you think it's time for a generational change in that advisory board?
Well, it doesn't matter what I think, really. I can only refer here to the fireside chat that Linus Torvalds did while we were at the Open Source Summit Europe, where Linus on stage said, it is time for new maintainers to develop in the open source community. We are all growing older. I mean, my beard by now is not as blonde gray as it used to be. It's mostly white now. And yes, so I mean, that's something we have to facilitate all over the open source ecosystem, is develop new contributors into roles where they can take over leadership. And it's going to happen because eventually many of us will retire.
Never mind die, exactly.
So it's a career opportunity for younger maintainers. Get in position.
So hipsters, exactly. If you're listening and if you're game to join a 30-year-old hobby project, I'm quoting Linus now, get on board. The URL will, of course, be in the show notes. Just go for it. And, of course, not just the Linux kernel needs fresh blood. All of the other initiatives that the Linux Foundation runs, of course, thrives by community engagement. Never mind the age bracket.
Yeah, and maybe just to add, it's not just a societal obligation, like a duty to serve. It's also fun. I didn't didn't become an open source contributor because I thought I need to carry the weight of the world on my shoulders. I did it because I liked the KDE desktop that we were developing at the time. I thought it was really cool and innovative, and I spent nights hacking on it, and I really enjoyed that. And I think it's a great way to learn about technology. If you really want to, like to the listeners, if you really want to understand how the software on your computer is running, there's no better way than to becoming a maintainer or contributor in one of the lower level open source projects. Yeah.
I think you hit a good point there as well with innovation, right? Because that's what is so prevalent in open source, I think, compared to your proprietary software, where it's all driven by sales and customer demand and stuff like that, right?
Customers, man.
Yeah. You don't have any customers, do you?
Users.
Users, yes.
Users.
Well, no. The proprietary software.
But this focus on innovation, this focus on innovation has a dark side to it as well in open source, right? We all would like to work on new things that are cool. I certainly did it this way. I always chose, can I add something here? Can I make this faster, better, or make it crash more dramatically? Nobody of us really likes to fix bugs for a long period of time. And this I think, or documentation, and this kind of amplifies the maintainer issue that we have, right? We need to understand that software is 20% writing new code and 80% it's fixing bugs and maintaining existing code. So both sides are important, but I understand that most people who are young and like to jump into open source development want to do some cool new thing. It's understandable, but we have to keep in mind that long-term maintenance is just as important.
Indeed. And with these closing remarks, it's time probably for the proxies.
Oh, no, hang on. No.
Martin has another question. Of course, Martin, go ahead. We still have about 30 seconds of these 6 hours.
Yeah, another 4 hours. Yeah, for sure. No, I mean, you've been doing this for a long time, right? So kind of if you project your experience with all your open source work and the Linux Foundation forwards, how do you see this looking like in let's say 5-10 years, right?
Make that 20.
100 even.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, predictions are always difficult, especially because they're about the future, right?
You listen to our podcast. Excellent. Do keep up the good work, Mirko. I'm impressed.
That gave it away, right? Sorry for that.
Don't worry about it.
So first of all, I see that the things we've been asking for a long time, like the regulators need to understand that open source is its own game, separate from companies in the ICT industry. This is coming to fruition. Have you seen the Cyber Resilience Act that says in one of the chapters in the caption says free and open source software? This is new, right? So
yes, I know. I noticed that.
We're entering a new era, I think, where the impact of open source, of the ecosystem, and of the innovation we drive is seen as equally important, let's say, or similarly important to what businesses do. And we're getting our own roles in the law. This is a huge success. We've been arguing about that for ever since I joined. Regulators should take us seriously. They should protect this ecosystem, public money, public code. And now we're seeing the outcomes of that. At the same time, this is scary because all of a sudden we have responsibilities, or at least a role to play, that is described in the letter of the law. And I think this is actually going to accelerate. And the emergence of AI and the current debate on definition of what open source AI is, which is not solved, still work in progress, and will be a difficult problem to solve. This will put our ecosystem, even more in the spotlight. We are gaining more and more a huge responsibility towards society because every device runs on open source software, and that will reflect back on us. And we need to make sure that the innovativeness of our crazy, motivated volunteer hackers, we can retain that is still there 10 years from now when the environment might be more regulated. So that's one thing I see. It's difficult to predict like what big technology is coming up next year, but But that's going to be another thing 2 years later anyway, so who cares?
Yeah, good point about the open source and AI. Right, it's probably a topic for another episode.
I'm not the expert on that, so
No, but it's definitely something that's is worthy of a more than a few seconds indeed. Anyway, with that, we go on to the boxes.
Yes. So, Mirko, what's your box?
I can't answer that question because I didn't figure out how I do that.
Simple. Mention anything that has crossed your path in the last couple of weeks worth mentioning. Whether it's a broken traffic light, whether it's the local city council in Berlin, anything goes.
Okay, I've been to California.
Good or bad. We would appreciate good, but bad goes as well. The bad ones are called the anti-poxes.
Okay, you want good things. Okay, now I have to think.
If possible.
Yeah, so I can say maybe just a joke, but I've been to California twice this year, once in January and once 2 weeks ago. And both times it was flooding rain. People tell me it's beautiful there. The sun always shines in California. Yeah. I do not believe that anymore because I have not seen it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where did you go to, by the way?
To San Diego and to San Francisco.
Both? Okay.
And both times, even in San Diego, there was flooding rain. So people tell me this has never happened.
I take it you went to San Diego after the election.
In January, actually.
That was the first trip, okay.
Mm-hmm. And the second one was just now.
I mean, the commies in San Francisco always get it wrong in the first place. I mean, but that's a known fact. Listeners in San Francisco, that was a joke, in case you're wondering. Okay, interesting.
Okay, so maybe one positive thing. I mentioned the collaboration with the European Commission, and this is not something that just happened 6 weeks ago, but in the last 12 months or maybe even longer. When we had the first meetings about the role of the open source ecosystem in the internal market, we had to explain a lot, and we weren't fully understood, I think.
Okay.
Which reflected in the texts, in the drafts, which worried us. And then within a very short period of time, the Commission representatives started to ask very pointed questions, where we listened to the questions and said, you must have spent a lot of time understanding open source, because your questions are not beginner's questions anymore. You're asking really complicated questions, like what's the oversight over projects? What happens if projects are forked? And all of these things. And then finally, only maybe 12 months later, when the final draft of the Cyber Resilience Act was published, it contains an understanding of open source that is very advanced. Like, it contains between the lines, I claim, a strong preference for upstream first development for manufacturers, which is something we've been preaching, but it's difficult for us to explain that to everybody. And lawmakers understand it and write it in a law in a hidden way. That's impressive.
So there's hope.
There's certainly hope, yes.
So for all the people who, and of course that does include you, Mirko, who are going to Brussels on a regular basis, Simon, Matthias, and all the rest of you, kudos left, right, and center. Finally, the word is getting through.
Thank you. I mean, we're building on the work that everybody has been doing for 20 years. We just have to be around when it finally succeeds. So.
By the way, did you hand them any copies of Ada and Sangerman, I wonder?
I didn't have any copies, but I think they've been shared left, right, and center in Brussels as well, including a movie now.
Exactly, because before I forget, blatant commercial, but there is actually a lovely Children's of All Ages book by the name of Ada and Sangerman.
Yeah, found out the book.
Exactly, that has been featured on this podcast about more than a year ago, actually, as in the first international reading of said book. Links, of course, within the show notes. If you are wondering what to get for a present in the course of 2025 when this episode will air, this is the book you want to buy. Martin, over to you.
My box.
Yes.
I have a couple, but
we still have about 25 seconds of these 4 hours remaining, so max yourself out.
Excellent. Now, my first one being the C language to counteract all the Rust publicity
What's the C language? language, Martin, I may wonder.
It's quite nice to.
It's
to
a
mess around with
successor
it.
of B and probably a predecessor of D,
It's
right?
hipsters among you. You should really forget about all this Rust nonsense.
The C language. Okay, before Martin will influence you with any lies, that language that Martin is probably referring to is about 50, 60 years old.
It's a bit
And
like
ancient
Linux, right? It's
operating
not very old.
Exactly. And ancient operating systems like Unix were written in it.
Indeed,
Never mind
indeed.
Linux. But the good news is
Brilliant.
basically that parts of the Linux kernel are replaced with Rust-based code rather than C. But Martin, I don't want to kind of steal your thunder. Just go ahead.
No, that was it. Really. That's fine.
That's it. You don't want to spill the beans on the apparent advantages of the C language.
Oh, we've covered this in length. Yeah.
No, Martin, I'm afraid this has been cut out. You do.
Oh, I guess we'll have to do another episode then on the benefits of C over Rust.
No, Martin, what are the apparent benefits of C over Rust then? Tell us, please.
Time, aren't we?
We do have time, yes.
Benefits. It's great.
Benefits, yes.
Mm.
Apart from the fact that Martin knows it.
Everything is written in this. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. We leave it at that.
It's one of the benefits.
Okay, links will maybe in the show notes if you don't have a clue what we're talking about.
Show notes are going to be extensive on this episode.
Yes, there was a previous episode about Rust in the Linux kernel, and Martin made some, let's put it this way, aspiring promises. But anyway, so Martin, what's your second box, if you have any?
Oh, my second box is a series called Interior Chinatown, which is quite fun to watch. It's full of twists.
Animated?
And no, it's not actually. It's
okay.
Quite fascinating.
Details of course within the show notes. Yes. Anything else we should touch upon, Martin?
I don't think so. We need to thank Mirko, of course, for his.
Maybe I can squeeze in my box.
Oh,
just in case.
Oh, okay. Go on. It's not Rust, is it?
Again. No, not again. No, my box is actually a recipe. Of course, details within the show notes. It's actually something that Martin did try out and survived. It's the spinach casserole that we had when we met. If you recall.
Yeah.
Of course, I won't mention anymore. As I said, the details within the show notes. And with that, Mirko, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you. My pleasure. This was fun.
And the good news is basically we didn't manage to put you to sleep. Very good. No jokes aside. It was very interesting, especially from the topics just slightly off topic in terms of beyond the Linux Foundation. Mm-hmm. And we do hope to have you back on the show at some stage.
Indeed.
I would love that. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. This is the Linux Inlaws.
You come for the knowledge,
but stay for the madness.
Thank you for listening.
We hope you like this feature presentation. If so, please spread the word. If not, please let us know. Feedback at linuxinlaws.eu.